All right, now let's talk about Redux, which is a different type of state management. So Redux is a pattern and a library for managing and updating application state, and it's centered around this idea of actions. Redux serves as a centralized store for any state that needs to be used across the entire app, and it's quite useful when we have an app that needs to keep track of lots of different state that's used by lots of different screens. That state needs to be updated frequently over time. The logic to update that state is complex, and the app has a medium to large code base. So this last point here is pretty important to emphasize. Redux is pretty complicated. There's a lot of different moving parts, and once you figure out how to use it and you start debugging it, it's pretty well built, so it has very solid debugging tools, but it does have a lot of overhead. It does take a lot of time to learn, and so I'd recommend pushing back Redux until you actually think you need it. And we'll talk about when to dive into Redux in just a little bit. So here's what Redux looks like. Without Redux, you might have something that looks like this on the left, where you have different components that are holding state in some manner, and they're passing they're passing state through navigation props, or they're passing it through getters and setters that are being passed through that are being threaded through components rather. And on the right side, you have what Redux looks like, where there's the central store that can be accessed and updated from any component using a very narrow API to reach into the store and update a particular item, or reach into the store and get the value of a particular item. And so with Redux, instead of application state being scattered across your entire component tree, application state is stored in the store. All application state is in one place. And that also makes it pretty easy to debug. So we're not going to go into it in too much detail, but just a few terms with Redux. There's this idea of actions that are plain JavaScript objects that have a type field. So maybe you have a add to cart action. It's an event that describes that something happened in the application. An action creator is a function that creates and returns the action object. So maybe we have a method that says add to cart, and what it does is it takes in a parameter of the item that you want to add to the cart, and it returns this JavaScript object that Redux will then use to add that item to the application state. So it'll go into the cart state and it'll update that value. A reducer is something that we define, and what it does is it takes in a state and an action object, and it figures out how to update that state on the store, and then it returns the new state. So reducers are actually a common programming term. They're not specific to Redux, but it's this idea of taking in some state and an action and then returning the new state after that action takes place. So maybe in the shopping cart example, we take in the current list of items in the cart, and we take in an add cart object, and then we return a new list that has the updated list of items in the cart. And as we talked about before, all application state lives in an object that we call the store. And so the store is just JavaScript object, so we can specify what that store looks like. And we have clear ways of updating items in the store and getting items from the store. So we can get items from the store using the getState method in Redux, and we also have a dispatch method that takes in an action object and will apply it to the store. And when we apply that to the store, it'll go through the reducer before actually updating the store state. So that was a pretty quick overview of Redux. And the reason we sort of breezed over this is because we want to emphasize that you shouldn't really use Redux until you have problems with vanilla React. And it's possible to get quite far without running into problems. And when you design your applications such that you lift state up and you only keep track of global state when you absolutely need it between two screens or different components, it's possible to create an application in a way such that you can minimize your need of Redux. But in the case that you do end up working on a pretty large or a pretty sizable React application or React Native application, you might want to go back through and read the Redux docs in more detail and try to understand exactly what the use case is and figure out how to implement it. But that is sort of your 2-minute crash course to Redux.